The night of the explosion. It was April 26, 1986, shortly after midnight, when one of the most peaceful nights in northern Ukraine turned into a catastrophe that would change the world forever. The city of Pripyat, with just over 50,000 inhabitants, slept peacefully. It was a model Soviet city, built especially to house the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the pride of the regime. The future seemed promising: clean streets, modern schools, young families, and a sense of progress in the air. But that night, inside Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, an experiment was about to spiral out of control. Engineers had planned a safety test to verify if the reactor could continue operating during a power outage. A simple procedure, but executed under extremely dangerous circumstances. Due to political pressure and communication errors, the test was initiated improperly, with safety systems deactivated and operators under enormous stress. Among them was Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer, a man known for his explosive temper and for despising the inexperience of his subordinates. When the operators warned that energy levels were dangerously low, Dyatlov insisted, "Continue the test. There is no danger." But there was. The RBMK-1000 reactor, which fueled Chernobyl, had a fatal design flaw. Under certain conditions, it could enter an uncontrolled chain reaction. At 1:23:04 a.m., when the operators pressed the emergency button, AZ5, something unexpected happened. Instead of slowing down, the reactor exploded. The ground shook, the walls cracked, and a wave of heat and radiation swept through the building. A blue flash, an almost supernatural light, illuminated the sky. The residents of Pripyat, still sleepy, saw the glow in the distance and thought it was just an ordinary fire. But that flash was the beginning of the greatest nuclear disaster in human history. Chaos reigned in the control room. Alarms blared incessantly. The operators tried to understand what had happened, but no one knew for sure. Dyatlov shouted orders while his eyes burned. No one had yet realized that the reactor core had completely opened, exposing tons of radioactive uranium. Soon, the first firefighters arrived at the scene. They weren't wearing special suits, just ordinary firefighter clothes. "It's just a fire on the roof," they said. But when they reached the top, they saw something they would never forget. The reactor was ablaze and pieces of incandescent graphite were scattered across the floor. One of the firefighters, Vasily Ignatenko, picked up a glowing piece in his hands and, in seconds, felt his skin melt. It was irradiated graphite from the core. Even so, he and his colleagues continued fighting the fire. None of them knew that every breath, every step, every touch was slowly killing them. The entire city of Pripyat watched the macabre spectacle of lights on the horizon. Children gathered on balconies, pointing to the blue glow that cut across the night sky. No one imagined they were being bathed in an invisible rain of deadly particles. Around 4 a.m., the fire seemed to be under control, but the tragedy was only beginning. Radiation spread through the air, the ground, and the water. Birds fell dead. The metallic smell in the air betrayed that something was wrong. Inside the plant, dozens of workers began to vomit and faint. Their clothes were removed and piled in the corridors, irradiated, hot, lethal. Doctors at the local hospital, unaware of what they were dealing with, treated the injured as if they were victims of common burns. Within a few hours, 31 people were already severely contaminated. And above them, invisible, a cloud of radioactive particles rose towards the sky, traveling across Europe. At dawn in Pripyat, the city had not yet been evacuated. Children went to school. People walked the streets, smiling, taking pictures of the distant smoke. The Soviet government remained silent. No one knew, but the world would never be the same again. Denial and silence. In the early morning hours of April 26, 1986, while smoke from Reactor 4 still spiraled into the sky, life in Pripyat continued as if nothing had happened. Children went to school, buses circulated, and couples strolled along the wide, clean avenues of the Soviet model city. The bright blue on the horizon had turned into a dense haze. Many residents felt a metallic taste in their mouths, others complained of headaches. Firefighters who battled the fire were hospitalized with mysterious burns that seemed to come from the inside out. But nobody knew what was really happening, because nobody was telling them the truth. Inside the plant, engineers and local authorities tried to assess the damage. The plant director, Viktor Brukhanov, refused to believe that the reactor had exploded. "That's impossible," he said. "RBMK reactors don't explode." But the impossible had already happened. The core was completely exposed and radiation had reached unprecedented levels. Even so, Brukhanov sent false reports to Moscow, downplaying the situation. "The reactor is intact. There is only structural damage to the roof." Meanwhile, thousands of onlookers gathered on nearby bridges to observe the smoke and the strange nocturnal glow. Many took photos, unaware that at that very moment they were being irradiated with lethal doses of cesium and radioactive iodine. That bridge would become known years later as the Bridge of Death. None of those who were there survived. In the afternoon, doctors in the region began to notice something unusual. Patients arrived with nausea, dizziness, and severe burns. The Pripyat hospital was overflowing with firefighters and workers from the nuclear power plant. Their highly contaminated clothing was thrown into the hospital basement and remains there to this day, still radioactive. Even in the face of this horror, the city was not evacuated. Local leaders awaited orders from Moscow, and Moscow awaited orders from no one. The Soviet government remained silent. No statement was made to the population. The KGB surrounded the area and confiscated documents, photos, and reports. Journalists were prevented from entering. The priority was not saving lives, it was saving the image of the Soviet Union. Throughout the 26th and into the morning of the 27th, the radiation continued to spread. Birds fell dead to the ground. The trees surrounding the plant began to change color, turning red. An entire forest would die in a matter of days, giving rise to what is now known as the Red Forest, one of the most contaminated places on the planet. Meanwhile, in Europe, radiation sensors in Sweden began to malfunction. The country was over 1,000 kilometers from Chernobyl, but the wind had carried radioactive particles there. Without understanding the reason, the Swedes thought there had been a leak at some local plant. When they discovered that everything was normal, they began to suspect that something terrible had happened in the Soviet Union. International pressure increased. It was impossible to hide what was becoming the worst nuclear catastrophe in history. Finally, on the afternoon of April 27th, the Soviet government authorized the evacuation of Pripyat, but the announcement was made calmly, almost bureaucratically. Cars with loudspeakers drove through the streets, announcing that the evacuation would be temporary, only for a few days. No one brought large suitcases. People left food on the table, toys on the floor, clothes on the clotheslines. At 2 p.m., 1,200 buses began to arrive. Lines formed on the avenues. Parents held children, elderly people walked slowly, many with empty stares. From each window, a life interrupted. One resident would recall years later. The sky was blue. The sun was shining. No one seemed scared. We thought we would return the next day. But we never did. When the last bus left, silence took over the city. A heavy, almost physical silence that still echoes today among the abandoned buildings. While Pripyat emptied, the true nightmare was revealed. The radiation continued to increase, and the contamination levels were already so high that no human being could approach the reactor for more than a few minutes without dying. And yet, they had to return. The invisible heroes. When Pripyat was finally evaluated, the true battlefield began to take shape. At its center, reactor number 4, an incandescent inferno, spewing radiation into the air at such high levels that a human exposed for even a few minutes would die within days. The priority now was singular: contain the open core and prevent it from burning down to the water table. If that happened, a second explosion, 1,000 times more powerful, could devastate all of Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Eastern Europe. The Soviet government assembled an emergency task force. Thousands of men were hastily summoned. Among them were firefighters, engineers, pilots, soldiers, miners, and volunteers. They would be called liquidators, those responsible for liquidating the consequences of the disaster. But the truth is, they were being sent to die, the fight against the reactor. The fire was still burning in several places. Helicopters began to fly over the reactor, dropping bags of sand, lead, and boron in an attempt to smother the flames and reduce radiation emissions. Each pilot made dozens of flights a day, knowing that with each flyover their body received a lethal dose. One of the flight officers later described it. The reactor looked like an open eye, shining in the dark. When we looked down, we felt as if something was watching us back. By the end of just 2 days, more than 600 flights had been made. Many of the pilots died months later from leukemia and internal burns. The Chernobyl divers. Meanwhile, a new problem arose. The water used to extinguish the fire had accumulated in the basements of the plant. If the melting core touched this water, it would explode with enough force to destroy the other 3 reactors. The solution would be to manually open the valves to drain the water. But there was a problem: no one could go in there and come back alive. 3 engineers volunteered: Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, Boris Baranov. Dressed in rubber suits and carrying flashlights, they descended into the flooded darkness of the underground. The radiation was so intense that the lights failed. The water rose to their chests. They knew there was no turning back. After endless minutes, the sound of a valve opening echoed through the walls. They had succeeded. The explosion was averted. Days later, the 3 died from acute radiation syndrome. But their names went down in history as the men who saved Europe. The miners of Tula and Donetsk. Even after draining the water, the risk was not over. The heat from the core threatened to melt the concrete and reach the ground. The solution would be to build a tunnel under the reactor, install a cooling system, and create a solid containment base. For this, 400 miners were called from the Tula and Donetsk regions. They worked in hellish conditions, digging without ventilation, and temperatures exceeding 50 degrees, often without clothes because the heat was unbearable. One of them would later recall, "We knew we were digging our own grave. But someone had to do it." It took them 30 days to complete the tunnel. Almost all of them died in the following years from cancer and radiation-related illnesses. The robots that failed. The next challenge was cleaning the reactor roof, where tons of radioactive graphite had been launched by the explosion. The doses there were so lethal that even the robots sent to the site stopped working. The circuits melted in minutes. With no alternative, the government decided to send men. Each soldier could only stay on the roof for 90 seconds. They ran, picked up pieces of graphite with shovels, and threw them back into the reactor. They worked in silence, hearing only the metallic sound of the shrapnel and the clock marking the time they had left to live. These men became known as the bio-robots of Chernobyl. Most died young. But thanks to them, the worst was avoided. The price of obedience. Meanwhile, Moscow continued trying to control the narrative. The disaster was only officially acknowledged days later, when international pressure became unbearable. Even so, the true extent of the tragedy was hidden for decades. Around 600,000 people participated in the cleanup operations between 1986 and 1989. Many didn't know they were exposed. Others simply accepted their fate. A Soviet general summed it all up in one sentence. They knew they were going to die, but they went anyway. These men didn't wear capes or shields, just courage and absolute silence. Without them, Chernobyl would have been the end of Europe. The silence that remained. The months that followed the Chernobyl explosion were filled with silence, pain, and denial. The world had witnessed the unimaginable, a nuclear power plant collapsing in the heart of the Soviet Union, and the consequences would not be measured only in numbers, but in lives, in fear, and in invisible scars. Under international pressure, the Soviet government created a special commission to investigate the disaster. Heading it was the scientist Valery Legasov, one of the few who dared to tell the truth. He testified before the authorities, exposing flaws in the RBMK reactor design, operational errors, and, above all, the system of lies that allowed it all to happen. It wasn't just the reactor that exploded in Chernobyl, Legasov said. It was the entire system. But the truth came at a price. Legasov was silenced, isolated, and discredited. 2 years after the disaster, on the second anniversary of the explosion, he was found dead in his Moscow apartment. He left behind recorded tapes where he recounted everything he knew. These tapes circulated secretly for years and would become, decades later, one of the most important pieces of evidence for understanding the magnitude of what occurred. Pripyat, the ghost town. Meanwhile, Pripyat remained abandoned. An entire city, 50,000 people, left behind as if time had stopped. Toys still in the parks, books on the tables, dolls on the beds. Radiation levels made return impossible. Nature began to reclaim the space. Trees sprouted from the asphalt, foxes hunted among the buildings, and the wind whistled through the broken windows. In the schools, the clock stopped exactly at 1:23 a.m., the moment of the explosion. Time, in Pripyat, never moved again. The trial. In 1987, a Soviet court tried 6 people directly responsible for the disaster. Among them, Anatoly Dyadlov, the chief engineer who commanded the test on the night of the tragedy. He insisted he was only following orders. They were convicted of negligence and violation of safety regulations. But many knew that the trial was merely a political charade, a way to blame individuals and protect the system. No sentence could reverse what had already happened. Around 350,000 people were permanently displaced, losing their homes, land, and histories. The economic, environmental, and human impact would be felt for generations. The echo around the world. Over the years, the winds of Chernobyl spread not only radiation, but change. Europe reinforced its nuclear safety protocols. Countries began to rethink the use of atomic energy. But perhaps the most profound impact was political. Chernobyl exposed the fragility of the Soviet Union and accelerated the process that would lead to its fall a few years later. The disaster had shown that the truth, however painful, is more powerful than any propaganda. In 2019, when the HBO series Chernobyl premiered, the world looked back at that forgotten night of 1986. And millions of people, in different languages, asked themselves the same question. How could this have happened? The new sarcophagus. In the 1990s, the reactor was covered with a concrete structure called the Chernobyl sarcophagus. But over time, it began to deteriorate. Between 2016 and 2019, a new colossal steel arch was built, covering the entire plant, one of the largest mobile structures ever created by man. This shield, known as the new safe confinement, is expected to last at least 100 years. But even so, the site will remain dangerous for more than 20,000 years. Chernobyl is not just a memory, it is an open wound in the history of humanity. The final silence. Today, those who visit the exclusion zone feel something difficult to describe. It's not just fear. It's reverence. The sound of the wind between the buildings of Pripyat, the creaking of a Ferris wheel that has been stopped for 40 years, the distant echo of a life interrupted. There, nature won, but at a devastating cost. Trees grew over the concrete, animals returned, and the radiation, invisible and persistent, continues to watch over every step. The Chernobyl disaster was not just a nuclear accident. It was a warning, a grim reminder that human arrogance can destroy what took millennia to build. And in the end, what remained was silence. A silence that does not forget. A silence that still shines in the darkness.